reading about leading up to Jesus' crucifixion, and this lesson we're here. What am I in the wrong one? Am I?
You're a week ahead, but I find the fault.
Yep, I sure am. I sure am. Well, we'll go with it. We'll go with it. And I was thinking as I was reading it, but I never went back earlier, and I thought, well, we kind of skipped a little bit, but all right, well, we'll go with it. If we need to go back next week, we will. I guess luckily we all know in here, we know the story. We know probably more than likely what those verses are talking about next week, or it should have been this week. We know what's in those. But Jesus is going to give up the ghost here. His time on this earth is done. And again, we've all heard these verses, but we'll just go through them. Maybe somebody out there, again, that's been following along with us hadn't heard these things. But on the understanding the context, it says, John states, they crucified him. His hands and feet were nailed to the cross. Humiliating voices jeered at him from passersby. Soldiers laughed as they divided his garments and gambled for his tunic. Pilate had a board placed above Jesus, stating in 3 languages, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And although the priest objected to the language, Pilate refused to change the wording, and as far as he was concerned, this was their king. We know that Jesus' mother and other women are near. But after crying, "It is finished," Jesus surrendered his spirit. And with Pilate's permission, Joseph of Arimathea, pronounce that for me, Joey, so I don't butcher it. Arimathea. Yeah. I was about to say that, but I wasn't positive. Yeah. And Nicodemus took Jesus' body down. We know he's going to be buried in Joseph's tomb, put away there. But because the Sabbath was fast approaching, they hastily prepared Jesus' body with spices and wrappings and buried him in Joseph's newly hewn tomb. And before we get into that, I was reading something yesterday, and it just seems like all of, you see that term AI, artificial intelligence. We're starting to see more and more of that. And this stuff's been going on for years, but now it seems like in the past 2 or 3 weeks, it's just all... They're painting that picture. They're distracting us from something. They're wanting us to look over here at this. But the bottom line, what I'm trying to get at is there was a guy that, now we have all these billionaires that they're wanting to freeze their bodies. And they think that, they're going to be able to one day have the technology to be back revived. And the scary part is these people are supposed to be super smart. And, they're the richest of the rich. And the brokest of the broke, I can tell them, that ain't going to happen unless Jesus wants it to happen. You are not getting revived and freeze your body. Do all that all you want. We know that. But all this AI stuff, it's just of Satan is all it is. People have just tried to play God so long that it's going to come back and bite them. There's all these technology companies are doing away with jobs now because they have found, we can now do this with all this technology we got. So all these people that have constantly tried to just outsmart life and just outsmart God, we know it's impossible, but it's starting to come back to haunt us. You think about it. If you've ever been, y'all gonna think, you can think I'm crazy, maybe people in here won't, but if you're talking about, let's say right now, I'll say, I like Zaxby's, I'm willing to put, I'm not going to put money on something. You know what I'm saying? You saw where I was going there. But I bet if I look at my phone later, there's going to be an ad for Zaxby's, right? Because I'm telling you, these things listen to you. They track you. They can know how long you look at something, right? And not to get down on that little wormhole, but all this stuff is... it seems crazy, but it's just Satan. They're tracking you. They're doing whatever they want to do because ultimately we've allowed them to do it. And over time, this thing right here is just all it is it's just a government tracker, and it's just making a little DNA of everything, and it knows probably knows more about us than our own families know about us. But again, we know that when we pass through this earth, when our time's done, y'all don't get caught up trying to freeze your bodies because it ain't going to do no good. Just a little soapbox there. But going on into the verses, John chapter 19, starting in verse 17. It says, "And he, bearing his cross, went forth into a place called the place of a skull, which is called in the Hebrew Golgotha, where they crucified him, and two other with him, on either side one, and Jesus in the midst." Just as on the way to the place of crucifixion, Jesus carried his own cross. Carrying the beam was part of the punishment Romans inflicted. And the other Gospels state that Simon of Cyrene was compelled to carry the beam for Jesus, who was at this point of collapse. So, it says he carried his own cross, but too, he's carrying our sins there with him. He had to do that for us to even have a remote chance of being in heaven. It says having someone carry this was not because of the compassion. The Romans wanted to make sure the criminal did not die before he reached the crucifixion site. So, this can tell us that if they're letting Simon over here carry this for Jesus, that tells you how close to death he already was, because they wanted to make sure he wasn't going to die. They were going to get their chance to mock him and throw him up. So, again, if we had any doubts, and I doubt any of us do in here, but if you have any doubts of how beat down he was obviously pretty close to the point of death just even walking up there, because they weren't just saying, well, you've had it a little rough, we want somebody else to carry it for you, give you a break. No, it was, we want to make sure you're not going to die before you get up here. Verse 19, "And Pilate wrote a title and put it on the cross, and the writing was Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. This title then read, Many of the Jews, for the place where Jesus was crucified was nigh to the city. And it was written in Hebrew and Greek and Latin. Then said the chief priests of the Jews to Pilate, Write not, the King of the Jews, but that he said, I am the King of the Jews. And Pilate answered, What I have written, I have written. So it said Romans commonly prepared a tablet detailing the offender's crimes, and they wanted to discourage others from committing the same felonies. And the sign Pilate prepared for Jesus was different from what was expected because it listed no crimes. It just said, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. So, I always think, and I have no proof of this, but to me, Pilate's just an interesting character in the Bible, because let's hit on what we'll talk about next week, I guess. He finds no fault in him. He says, and obviously here, he don't write any crimes that's happened. So I'm not saying that he's a believer or whatnot. He's just an interesting character because he had this power. He even gives it up to the Jews and says, who do y'all want here, right? And they still say, get rid of Jesus, who we know walked a perfect life, did nothing wrong. But he lets them know, hey, this is the King of the Jews. Whether they like it or not, he puts it there. Verse 23, it says, Then the soldiers, when they had crucified Jesus, took his garments and made 4 parts, to every soldier a part, and also his coat. Now the coat was without seam, woven from the top throughout. They said therefore among themselves, Let us not rend it, but cast lots for it, whose it shall be, that the scripture might be fulfilled, which saith, They parted my raiment among them, and for my vesture they did cast lots. These things, therefore, the soldiers did. So, we go back and look at it in Psalm 22 here. It says, Just as Pilate unwittingly declared the truth with his sign, the soldiers unknowingly fulfilled Old Testament prophecy with their actions. Psalm 22:18 states, They part my garments among them and cast lots upon my vesture. So again, just as we were talking about last week, one more example, and we have other examples too in this lesson alone. Another example of how the Old Testament and New Testament tie right into one another. You can't have one without the other. You got to have both of them. Because, again, this sounds so simple. We all understand this. All of this was prophesied earlier on. And Scripture can always point back to it. But there's just, for some reason, there's a group of people that just think that, well, all that stuff in the Old Testament, that don't apply now. And we have enough sense to know that's not true. None of it contradicts itself. It's all truth. It says the coat or tunic Jesus wore would have been like a long linen t-shirt that came down to or below the knee. And rather than rip it into pieces, the soldiers cast lots to see who would get it. Again, the mockery. Well, let's place some bets. Let's throw down, see who's going to get this king's clothes, And it says, while the soldiers' actions may seem to be a minor detail, it's a reminder that in the death of Jesus, nothing was left to chance. The crucifixion's every element was in keeping with God's redemptive plan. So again, going back to Psalm there, 22:18, said this was going to happen. So again, to where we could just read right over that, never think anything about it, still ties back to prophecy that exactly would happen, and it did. Verse 25, now there stood by the cross of Jesus his mother and his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Cleophas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciples standing by whom he loved, he saith unto his mother, Woman, behold thy son. And then saith he to the disciple, Behold thy mother. And from that hour that disciple took her unto his own home. So we'll talk a little bit, we can point some of this back to a little bit of the Ten Commandments it does in this lesson too. It says, as he had done elsewhere in this gospel, John did not identify her by name. He simply referred to her as his mother. And the second woman was Mary Magdalene, out of whom Jesus had cast 7 demons. Jesus continued to show kindness. Even in the moment of intense personal suffering, he commended the care of his mother to the disciple whom he loved, meaning John, the writer of the gospel. So, goes through about 3 or 4 things here. It says, first, Jesus knew and obeyed both civil and religious law. The statement commending Mary's care to John followed a form known as testamentary disposition, the legal transference of responsibility that occurs after a person's death. So, I think you put it in a modern terminology. Again, we've been at deathbeds before, and that person says, hey, I want you to take care of your father, when I'm gone, or, a dad, take care of your mom when I leave, right? Kind of the modern day, we could tie that to how that looks. It says, Roman law allowed someone to make such a declaration, even from a cross. So, again, it says Jesus was obedient to the Father, even to his last breath. In providing for Mary's care, he followed the commandment, honor thy father and thy mother. So, even though he's there dying on the cross, he's telling John, hey, take care of my mom. My time here is minutes away here. I'm giving that responsibility to you. And, think about that. People don't follow that commandment anymore. Honor thy mother and father. We can just look really, starting at my generation and the generations below me, it's just plain disobedience. Just mocking their parents. How many times have we heard people say, my generation specifically, my parents, they don't know anything, and they just don't understand the world that we live in, and it's just, we get further and further and further of that commandment being obeyed. But I think this is an interesting point here, what we're about to say, and sometimes it can be a tough pill to swallow, but listen. It says, Jesus entrusted his mother's care to the beloved disciple rather than his half-brothers who had not yet placed their faith in him or become part of the mission. And you think about that, again, tough to stomach, but really that's where it's not about the saying blood's thicker than water, because we say that, that's just a common American phrase. But if you really want to go at it, it's more like a believer is thicker than a non-believer. Because it's not saying he didn't love his brothers. He's not saying that. It's not saying that by no means. But it's like this. If I'm leaving this earth, I want to make sure the people I love most have somebody that understands the truth and is leading them that way. Again, it's not saying that, he thought his family was just horrible people. But he thought, I know you're a true believer. I know what you're about to go do. Take care of my mom. Right? And even in death, he's concerned with her. Not just his mom, anybody. But, he had concern for all of us there. But it's true love and obedience to his Father's will that even in death, he's thinking about those people. That's true love. Now, we're all here, so we don't understand this thought process yet. None of us. We all have something in common. We don't know what it's like in your final moments or final days. We don't know what that feels like. We don't know what's going through your mind. But in the most perfect person ever walked the earth, in his mind, he was going through physical pain, but he's thinking about in this instance, just these few verses here, he's concerned with his mom. You know, he's concerned with the one that's raised him. And, you know, we hear this saying, and I believe this too, that there's nothing like a mother's love, right? You know, I can admit it. I'm 28 years old, and still sometimes if I feel like Hannah don't have the answer, I'll text my mama. You know, that's just what we do. It's a bond, and we can see it here. Verse 28, it says, "After this, Jesus, knowing that all things were now accomplished, that the scripture might be fulfilled, saith, I thirst. Now there was set a vessel full of vinegar, and they filled a sponge with vinegar, and put it upon hyssop, and put it to his mouth. And when Jesus therefore had received the vinegar, he said, It is finished. And he bowed his head and gave up the ghost." It says Jesus understood one prophetic word was yet to be fulfilled. In stating that he was thirsty, Jesus not only spotlighted his humanity, but also fulfilled the prophetic word of Psalm 69:3, and then 20 through 21 there. Again, this exact moment is mentioned in those verses. If you go and go back right now and go read those, it mentions this exactly happening about the vinegar. And again, just another example, tying Old Testament to New Testament. And you know, so what does it say? Jesus said there, I thirst, right? He's 100% God and 100% man. So there's nothing that we've experienced, or a pain, mental or physical, that Jesus don't understand, right? And so he's human here. He's thirsting. He's been beaten. You know, he's got broke bones. He's suffocating to death, and he's got thirst. So it's not like where you're sitting in a hospital bed and they give you one of those little plastic mugs and a straw in it, and they're giving you ice chips and water. No, that's not what they do. It says the soldier's behavior was not one of compassion, but of contempt and ridicule. So, you know, they give him vinegar. Again, it's not just like some cave spring water he's getting put up to his mouth. It says the visual of holding it up to the parched lips of this crucified rebel would have certainly elicited mocking laughter from both the Romans and Jews who stood nearby. Pure evil. You know, they have no care that Jesus is who he says he is. And they're laughing. You know, they're cutting up. If this is such a king, if this guy can do everything that he said he's did, if he can do what people have told us he can do, why can't he pull himself off this cross? And you know, they're sitting there laughing at Jesus on the cross as he is dying. And I'm not saying we do that. But when we look at sin, how bad are sometimes our human mind of, we just want to see something. It's not that we're not a believer, but sometimes we lack the faith and want to see something happen instead of, you know, really believe. It's like this. None of us standing here today has saw Jesus walk on this earth. We haven't saw that. But we have the faith, and we believe that because of what we've read, what we have saw in our own lives, and believe that that's true. They're sitting here wanting to see some type of miracle happen just so they can, you know, that's their idea of believing. That's not the real true belief. They're not believing what he has said. They're not believing what he can do. They're about to here in just a short few hours. But it says, Jesus said, it is finished. And the penalty for sin had been paid. Humanity's redemption comes only through faith in Jesus. So Christ had a mission. And what does he say there? He says, it is finished. We've heard it, the word tetelestai. Christ had a mission, and he had served it. He had served it on this earth. Right? He had went out. He had made disciples. He had preached and taught, all in these areas. He had served what he had to do. But while his mission was finished, those disciples and our mission was just getting started. Right? You know, he taught there for 3.5 years. He's on this earth, 32, 33 years here. Never did anything wrong. The only being to ever live the most perfect life. But we still have people that just can't wrap their head around that he is the only answer to any problem we have. You know, We can say, it's just like Rhett had an ear infection, right? I can say that antibiotic helped that. It did. But it all goes back and points to God. There was somebody that he allowed to be born that had the sense to, well, this right here and this chemical makeup, this will cure an infection, right? It all points back to him. It's not a doctor. It's not just a medicine. It's not just science. Everything in this world points back to him. And then you have the people that like to use that against you. How many times have we heard, I call it free spirits, whatever you want to call it, just people that there's no rule. Well, there's these coca plants and coca. He put that on this world, don't you think, Well, he also, we can go right back to Genesis. He put a tree and said, don't touch it, right? Just because he put it on this world didn't mean, well, just go use it and do whatever with it, right? Don't fall into those tricks. But going back to the lesson of it is finished, what Jesus had did here, his time was done. But really, it was just getting started. It really was. Because, they're excited there for those, 2 or 3 days. And then when everything starts shaking around, we've already talked about this a few weeks ago, that they're paying people off. Hey, guards, you just tell them, something happened. Nobody stole this body. Don't go tell what you're saying here. Because we can't have that. You can't silence Christ. Think about it. Go back to those guards standing there guard at his tomb. There was only 2 or 3 of them there that knew exactly what had happened, right? If they could have just kept their mouth shut, again, it always goes back, somebody's always going to talk. Always going to talk. And if they would have stayed quiet, well, then they could have just ended, everything Jesus said was going to happen. Nobody would have ever believed it. But that's not the way God works. Everything is always going to end up working to glorify Him, one way or another. Right now, it may not seem like it on this earth that we live in and everything we read about. But it's coming full circle. And what we got to remember is we have a job to do. And we can't worry about if people are going to move and believe on the things that we say. All we can be in control of is telling them about Jesus. Telling them about what this Bible says. Because that's what, ultimately, as we're taking our last few breaths in, that's what we're going to be thinking about. As a Christian, that's what we need to be thinking about, is being able to be proud of what we've done. Being able to know that we did. And there's no way we're going to be able to do everything we could have because we all fall short. But knowing that, hey, I did my job. Look at it like this. If we walk this earth 80, 90 years and only one person gets saved just because of a seed we planted, hey, that's not a failure. That's one more person that didn't have to die and go to hell. Don't get caught up judging numbers. Just know that everything we do, we need to be doing it for the Lord. And if we're not, there's no sugarcoating it. We ain't doing good enough. To show how really far we have fell as just a world, not just a country, but I'm really about to sound like I live in the dark ages, but let's just be real. If we were being real, standing before Jesus Christ, He wouldn't look at us. I'm talking to myself here. He's not going to look at us and say, how many Braves games did you go to when you walked this earth? I see Jessica laughing back there. But look, I'm not bashing us, but seriously, that's not what Jesus is going to care about. Because we don't ever read in here where it says, Jesus and them, went on a Royal Caribbean cruise and they just kicked it up and stopped talking about the Lord for a few days. That's not what we read about. Again, I'm talking to all of us in here. I'm not saying that, everything's doom and gloom. But ultimately, as longer that we're here on this earth, the further and further and further away the world just gets from God. That's just the truth of it. But bottom line is, let's just be able to lay our heads down at night knowing that we're doing what we can for the Lord. And that, when we walk out of these doors, that people are seeing that. And a good indicator of that is we talk about this a lot. When people, walk away from us, or if they say something, oh, I'm sorry, you're probably doing what you need to be doing because they feel bad enough to say that, Let's just pray for our families too. I know we've all got people out there that just, that are close to us or cousins, whatever, but let's just pray for them. Because we can't give up on people, because Christ didn't give up on us. And just as he was carrying that cross up, there's no doubt in my mind. I mean, we can't understand God's greatness, right? So to us, this may seem taboo, but I believe he was thinking about every single person that's ever walked this earth as he was going up there. And I think he could know them by name, know them every detail about their life. He was thinking about them, though, knowing I'm doing this so they can be with me and my Father one day. Anybody got anything? I won't mess up which lesson next week. I knew when Marie started looking at me, I'm like, what's she looking like that for? And I just started going to the front of the book, and I'm like, yep. All right. Joey, you want to close us?
I will. Most kind and gracious Father, Lord, we thank you for this day, the opportunity to come to your house. Be with our church family one more time. Thank you for this lesson we've heard this morning from Tom and Hannah, that precious family, what they mean to our family, to our church. Lord, I pray that you just bless them and all that they do. Lord, each and every one that's come this way this day, each and every home and family that's represented, I pray that you'd be with them. You know the needs, Lord, the requests that have been spoken here this morning. Pray that you grant them according to your perfect will. Go with us through the rest of this service, dear Lord. Lord, Brother Mel, Sister Wendy, and the choir. Do our singing, Lord, as we lift our voice in praise to you and the opening of your word, dear Father, I pray. The Holy Spirit would meet and teach us, Lord, that we stand in need of. That everything we say and do this day might bring you honor, glory, and praise. For you alone are worthy.